Welcome to NewYorkBIO's Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Glen Vries, co-founder and co-CEO of Medidata and author of The Patient Equation.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, my name is Jennifer Hawkes-Bland, and I'm the CEO at NewYorkBIO. Thank you for joining us today. We have an amazing guest, Glen Vries, founder of Medidata, is with us today, and we're going to talk all things technology and clinical trial, and I will kick it over to them in a minute. But first, thank you to Glen, our sponsor of our breakfast series. And New Yorkers got some very good news from Governor Cuomo on Friday that our children can return to school in person this fall, pending certain things. So I know a lot of people have been scrambling and working on that. But as you do make your determinations about your return to work and your colleagues and what they're doing, we certainly have resources on our website, and we're happy to help connect you with any resources that you feel you need, to make those decisions about returning to the office. On a personal note today, in the storm last week, a massive tree fell on my house. So if I have to go dark today, it is because they are cutting up a massive tree that is currently on the roof. And I do not want to disturb the rest of the recording. So if I pop out, don't think I've just fallen off the face of the earth. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Derek to introduce our guest. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much, Jennifer. And Glen, good morning. It's fantastic to have you with us. For our audience, Glen Vries is a co-founder and co-CEO of Medidata, which is really just a fantastic New York startup story. And, we usually start this, Glen, with a little bit of an origin story. And, one of the nice things we'll get into today is Glen has just written a book. It's called The Patient Equation. It's going to come out on Amazon soon. I think I included the link in our last email. So Glen, can you kind of take us back to really the founding of Medidata? Because it's interesting. I read the book, and in a lot of ways, a lot of times the book tends to be the story of how the company was built, but that wasn't the story in the book. You spent all the time talking about data and other things with patients, which is wonderful. But can you talk to us a little bit about where the company came from? You get a little snippet of running back and forth at Columbia in the mid '90s because you had these paper records. And it was really silly that you had to transfer them by hand.
Yeah. So it's actually the book really isn't about the company, but obviously my experience with the company is
right
in there. But the origin of both really goes back to this research I was doing at Columbia. I was working on a project in prostate cancer where we were trying to do a better job of figuring out who would benefit from different kinds of therapies, very specifically looking back then at radical prostatectomy, having your prostate removed. So you have somebody, they have prostate cancer, and I am not up to date on all the urology literature these days, but back then, and I assume there's still problems around this to some degree, but you could have this, what was back then much more invasive surgery. And 5 years later, even though you thought the surgery was successful, you wind up with metastatic prostate cancer. And what we were trying to do is add some additional information, in this case from a blood assay, to figure out what patients would really benefit from that therapy or should go down another therapeutic course. And there I was, a kid professionally, as you said from the book, running around from building to building. I was running assays at my lab bench. I had stacks of paper. I had to go to different buildings to get some of the patient follow-up data. It was all on this will date me, a Windows 95 PC that we shared in the back of the lab. And I was sharing a lab bench. I always say to people at Medidata, like, if you've never done like research in a laboratory, you've probably taken like high school chemistry, and there's like a person who through test tubes you stare at all day. And the person who I stared at all day was a resident who was training in urology. And both of us were really interested in technology. And remember, there's that shared Windows 95 PC. The internet was turning into a thing. And we realized that we could buy books online. Like, that's another thing that'll date me. The only thing you could buy on Amazon then was books. But there must be a better way to connect all these people, all this data. And he knew more about what was going on from an industry perspective, because we were collaborators with Pfizer and Takeda on their clinical trials. I was experiencing what it was like to run an academic study. Actually, my kind of Uber boss was a very famous urologist. So everybody was calling to collaborate, and all the work for that kind of rolled downhill to me. And that was really like the moment. It was like, well, maybe we could use the internet, this crazy new thing, to connect all of the people who are working on a clinical trial. And that's really been the theme that Medidata has been about for the last 20 plus years now. You know, it was interesting. We connected people who were professionals, because we always thought about the computer in the office, the computer in the treatment room being a place where the doctor, the nurse could access. Obviously, a data manager, a pharmaceutical company employee, somebody at a CRO, they would have a computer. And then about halfway through the story of Medidata, all of a sudden mobile became a thing, and we realized, oh no, everybody's got a computer, right?
Yeah.
And you can connect the patients as well. And so that was really the beginning of Medidata, those research days. So obviously we're a technology company, we're a data company, but we're really a company that was founded by people who were interested in patient outcomes. And it's kind of motivated us for the last couple of decades.
So what was kind of the kernel of events that started it? How did you meet Tarek? How did you meet your co-founder? And what did like the first year of the company look like?
So the way we met Tarek is kind of hilarious. So there's Ed Ikaguchi, who was at AI Cure now, and me, and we're talking about this thing, and we go to this guy who's like 10 years older than us at the hospital, a friend of ours. We're like, dude, we have this great idea. We're going to do clinical online. And he is like, this is a terrible idea. Like, what? This is great. And this was like when we literally had taken the bed out of my bedroom in my 5th floor walk-up 1-bedroom apartment and turned it into like a little office, you know, that we would use on weekends and after work to make the prototypes of what would become Medidata Rave. And this guy's like, no, I love the idea of what you're doing, but you know about science, you know about medicine, and you know about computers, but you don't know anything about money. You don't know anything about companies. And you can't start a company unless you have those skills. And I was like, wow, that's really good advice. Where would we find somebody like that? And he's like, I have no idea. But I went to college with some guy who I think does something related to money. And Tarek was working at a family office doing investing work, not his family office.
Yeah.
And he had invested in a lot of technology companies. He's invested in Quintiles before it was a public company. So he understood the clinical research industry. For those not old enough to, I guess everybody on the call should probably remember Quintiles, but it's now IQVIA. But back then it was much smaller. And literally because of a mutual friend, we meet after work, and we just fell in like instant business love. And it was a 3+ hour meeting. And after that, our offices, we had by that point moved to a little office in Midtown. Our offices were like a mile apart, and it was beers after work and talking on the phone all the time and hanging out. And we just decided to throw in together. And Tarek literally rolled a desk chair, because we didn't have any extra, with a computer monitor on it, a mile down New York City streets. He and I, we still share an office. Like, there's literally not a wall between our desks. And it goes all the way back to that first day when he came up in the elevator with his chair and kind of rolled it up to the desk. And the first year was really us just getting our feet wet in, I think, the process of providing infrastructure kind of more professionally. Like, we had understood clinical trials, we'd run them, we worked in them, but we didn't have none of us really, any business experience in terms of client vendor kind of things. So we worked with a lot of academic studies, friends of friends. We didn't make any money. And that was kind of, we just kind of did bigger and bigger projects and more things. And Amgen, Genentech became, over the years, those were kind of like big milestones of companies started to work with us. So that was kind of, the first year was a lot of running around and trying to figure out what the hell we were doing.
Yeah. So you preempted my next question, which were what were some of the big kind of milestone things that happened, and perhaps after the first year, because now, you look at what Medidata does now, and the breadth of services that you offer is enormous. The number of things that you're into is really pretty. It's amazingly comprehensive. So, what were some of the things where you kind of realized that you could do more, or what were some of the kind of the biggest things that made you say, yeah, we're here to stay, and now we're gonna grow, and now we can get bigger? What was kind of the pivot point?
Well, it was very complimentary of you. I still think we have a lot of work to do, but I can kind of tell you there was the early days where, again, things were crazy. I'll say I think the worst year of my professional life was when we went from like 50 to 150 people in a year. I think because we really understood the experience of working in and running a clinical trial when we were helping these professionals. People just liked using our software. Even when it was relatively young and immature, it just felt good. And so that really fueled our growth. And, we were hiring people like crazy. It was like, hey, welcome to Medidata. This is your computer. I think this is your client's phone number. The software may or may not work today. Like that was your training. But we did manage to kind of scrape our way out of that kind of startup phase. There were a lot of companies who were doing what we were doing on trying to use the internet in different ways. It was kind of the electronic data capture industry was born. Phase Forward at the time was a really big, the 800-pound gorilla, if you will, of the industry. And there were lots of companies like Medidata. We wound up raising a pretty big financing from Insight Venture Partners in New York, or at least big back then. It was $10 million. And that kind of distinguished us, I think, from the rest of the field. So all of a sudden, with Phase Forward, and there was kind of Medidata up and coming. So I actually think that funding event came at a really good time. It was really helpful to us. We didn't even necessarily need the money as much as we needed to have companies who were now going to do real research with us and make a bet on their pipeline with us, realize that we weren't going to go out of business tomorrow. We weren't three guys in a fifth floor walk up. We were, we would survive some kind of event. And then I think if you, from a strategy perspective, I kind of alluded to it before. We were connecting professionals on the internet, and it was literally listening to Steve Jobs at an Apple Worldwide Developers Conference. For people like those, they just did one, and Tim Cook now does what Steve Jobs was doing back then. But they talk about the number of iPhones that are out there, for example. And the reason they talk about that is to get developers to say, oh, great, I can develop things for the iPhone, and there's a huge market. Yeah. We're listening to that, and we're like, wow, the largest, most important constituency in research projects, the patients, are now people that we can connect to the clinical trial directly. So the same way we kind of floated stuff on the internet, we now said, let's float stuff on mobile to connect the patients. And so that gets you from kind of the end of the first decade. The second decade was really about the patient connectivity as part of what we were doing. And then about halfway through that, it was the same kind of strategy around kind of what can we float on top of stuff, but it really happened with Medidata's infrastructure. So there we were. I think by that time, Oracle had bought Phase Forward. I think we basically put ourselves in an industry leadership position. And so the fact of the matter was we were just doing a lot of research. And that same thought of like, why do I have to go to different buildings, and why can't I connect all this data from my days in the laboratory? Well, now it's like, why can't we connect all this data across our clients? Why shouldn't we be able to float something on top of Medidata that provides more value? And that was the beginning of really kind of us becoming a company that was about analytics and about finding more information in data that was being gathered in research. And it was a really exciting time. We realized that there weren't a lot of people who really understood how to do that in the clinical trial industry. So people from insurance, we had a legitimate rocket scientist, like somebody who designed guidance systems for rockets. And we kind of brought all this expertise in to look at how we could do different, more interesting things with data. So that was kind of the last 6 years, call it. And then last year, we had this really interesting thing happen to us, which was we were acquired by Dassault Systèmes. And I'll tell you, when I first had a meeting with somebody from Dassault Systèmes, I was like, why does somebody from like the jet company want to talk to me?
Yeah.
But it's a different company. It comes from the same Marcel Dassault, but one's for airplanes The other one is software that was used originally to make those airplanes, but that's 30 years ago. And what was really exciting, and still is for us, is that they're a company that really thinks about how you make things in a very scientifically structured way, with them working as an important measurable outcome. And I'll kind of paraphrase one of the things that that Bernard Charles, who's the CEO of Dassault, said to me that got me so excited. You know, Dassault System software is used to make like 8 out of 10 planes in the world and 9 out of 10 cars. Now it's being used to make a lot of molecules and medical devices for therapies. You know, every single one of those cars drives. Every single one of those planes flies. Not only do they design, but they go through simulation, they go through processes to make sure when you actually make it, it works. Are we going to make 10 out of 10 new molecules work? That might be a hyperbolic, lofty goal, but 1 out of 10 is not acceptable, nor is 2, right?
I really like that. I like that line in the book, actually.
Oh, thanks.
Not to spoil it, but at the end of the book, there's, you know, how do we get from, you know, basically the gap between 1 out of 10 or 1 out of however many molecules actually making it to a patient and making it into real treatment, versus, you know, if we do something with an airplane, like it's going to fly 100% of the time, how do you make this a little better? And, you know, I suppose the nice thing here is that, especially in biology, small and incremental gains tend up having a very large impact on patients, right? We think about things like immunotherapy, where as of right now, we get them to the right patient probably about 20% of the time. We just don't know which 20% of the patients are going to respond to them. And it's increases in those type of areas that, you know, really have, you know, very, very large outcomes in terms of survival.
Yeah, and finding the kind of interesting therapeutic capabilities of things that might already be in our toolkit, but we're just we're not using them. You know, one of the people who I talk about in the book, there's actually a collaborator and friend, is David Fagenbaum, the guy who runs the Castleman Disease Collaborative Network, and has it. And you know, he basically saved himself, realizing that mTOR was part of the cascade that caused his disease, and he took a drug that's for patients with kidney transplants, right? And so, you know, even just thinking about the data, thinking about the biology, as you say, as a component of, as the root of all of these things that ail us, opens up a whole new way of thinking, and I think a whole new way of creating that success that we're talking about, which everybody benefits from.
Glenn, before we get away from the origin story part of our conversation, you are talking to a New York bio audience. So New York spends a lot of time talking to ourselves over the last, say, decade about how we were building life sciences, right? We didn't have this or that or whatever. And so we've made a lot of strides. Tell us about how it was to build the technology company that was adjacent to life sciences in New York.
So, not in like a self-congratulatory way, but I think we were kind of blazing that trail before there was a real technology scene in New York. Back to those early days, people say, so you're a technology company for the life sciences industry and you're in New York, why? And the answer was, because we're New Yorkers. This is where we live. But remember I was saying before that we imported a lot of talent from different industries? And one of the places that we wound up realizing there was a very vibrant technology scene in New York 20 years ago was on Wall Street. So we got a lot of people who had spent their lives in finance, in what we'd probably call fintech now, or some other cool way to talk about it. And you know, we realized that there were possibilities to get people who were great engineers and technology people in the city. Now, I think what's great is we have a super vibrant startup and I think established technology community. Actually, I live right across the street from the building that IBM Watson moved to, and in the neighborhood is where I believe it's still all the artificial or the computer vision stuff from Facebook is there, because we're right next to the Quran Institute of Mathematics, which is one of the best computer science graduate schools. And so I think, look, let me take a step back. I grew up in New York. Why do I love New York? I love New York because like everything's here, right? We have this incredibly diverse set of people, talents, things you can enjoy in life. But when you're creating a company and you have that diversity that you can draw from, and you can bring people from another place, we got tons of great people as it started to grow up, was like when internet ads became a new big hot thing.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden there was because all the media and marketing companies were here, there were really interesting people who were working in that industry who we'd bring in. And I think that's what defines like a great New York company. I think that's what makes it great to be a New Yorker, is you can pull from all these things and smash them together and make interesting new things out of them. So yeah, clearly I have on my shoulder.
You're biased, of course.
Yeah. Well, also, I think we see now that the biotech companies that are starting here are realizing that New York has this absolute wealth of PhD students and postdocs that they graduate every year. So we've got this absolute gold mine of young scientific talent that is, exceptionally well trained and, really kind of ready to go into new and exciting work. So it's one of the things that we're really excited about.
Yeah, and there's a lot of funding here too, right? There's a whole scene of private investors and venture capital companies who are super interested in New York. Why go out there and fight it out with all the crazy people in California with their valuations and all that? Not that I think New York isn't catching up in ways, but and I know the world has changed a lot in the last 6 months, obviously, but I don't think that aspect of it is different. I think you have an opportunity to be, it's not a perfect metaphor, but a bigger fish in a smaller pond, or maybe a more interesting fish in a smaller pond. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. So it's interesting that the last chapter in your book is about the pandemic. And obviously this was now written, I imagine, at a much earlier stage of the pandemic, right? So, if you could, I don't know if you could kind of rewind or anything like that, but can we talk a little bit about data in the pandemic? Because you mentioned that, life sciences really has this window of opportunity. And, I think from a therapeutic standpoint, they've nailed it, right? The companies have accelerated all sorts of timescales. I imagine, I don't know how much of this you can talk about, but I imagine that that Medidata is probably involved in some of the clinical efforts underway. So can you talk a little bit about how, let's talk a little bit about Medidata and the pandemic, and then transition into a more, kind of top-down look from the industry perspective. So when the pandemic started to hit, what were some of the things that you as a company, kind of wanted to do and tried to do?
Yeah, so when the pandemic hit, we started to, as I said, we looked at what we can float on top of Medidata's infrastructure and create value for our clients. A lot of that is aggregating information and just giving them a view of what's going on in the world, right? We're kind of, I actually kind of like to think of us as like an instrument in some ways. Like, you might take a patient and put a bunch of wearables on that patient to measure stuff about it. Well, like Medidata is kind of like a bunch of wearables on the life sciences industry, right? We know how many trials are getting started. We know how many patients are enrolling and dropping out. And so we tried to be a useful set of sensors that we could give some data to our clients. Actually, we gave it to the world. We started publishing it on our website. It's events like this. I think it's important for people to come together, obviously, and work on it. So we did that. We tried to work with our clients to figure out how they could continue to run their clinical trials to the degree that they could. And this is obviously not inclusive of things related to COVID-19. Like you mentioned the research that's going on. I do think the industry has reacted in a terrific way, although I'll get back to this, I think kind of in somewhat traditional way, but responding and accelerating timelines. And as far as I can tell, a huge amount of that research is actually being done on the Medidata platform, so we're delighted to be able to participate in that. But the other side of this is that the world is going to come out of this a lot sicker on average, and that's not hyperbolic. I mean, you've had this period of measurable in fractions of the year where people were not going to the doctor, right? Mm-hmm. So how many things that would have been diagnosed in otherwise healthy people got missed? You have people who have chronic conditions who weren't getting maintenance for their therapy, people with life-threatening conditions who weren't getting their chemotherapy, right? Because they were immunocompromised and couldn't show up in a hospital.
They couldn't go out.
Right. So there's this, there's no way to talk about the pandemic and say, oh, well, isn't this great that we had all this innovation? Like I feel like we got to look back and say, well, what could we have done differently? And was there a missed opportunity? And I think, unfortunately, there was, and I hope it's kind of like a lesson for people and maybe galvanize people to work differently in the future. I stuck this in the book. So we wrote the book and there was nothing about the pandemic in it. And then the printer that was printing the book closed and ultimately went out of business. And so it created this crazy opportunity. We basically did a second edition of the book before the first edition ever came out and added some stuff around SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. And one of the things that happened, and there's a snippet of it in there, is a friend of mine sent me an article that she'd seen. She's the dean of the science school at Carnegie Mellon, and so she's a biologist and a statistician. She sends me this article from Science magazine, like the same Science magazine that I'm sure a ton of people on this call get, except it was from 1918. And it was about, the issue was from 1919. And the article was about Spanish flu. And it is talking about coughing into your sleeve. And it's got all the stuff that they were doing. And it was all the stuff that we were doing, right? We hadn't really made any progress. And then there was this whole piece of the article about how it would take months, if not years, to assemble all the data to really understand who was susceptible to Spanish flu, what the long-term consequences of being exposed to Spanish flu were. And it was like, wow, in 100 years, we have literally made no progress. We have all of this connected data, and yet our ability to respond to a global pandemic has gotten, as far as I can tell, nowhere. Now, to your point, nobody should be ashamed of the work we're doing as an industry. It's fantastic. Like, we are responding from a biological and clinical development perspective in a way that, of course, we would not have been able to 100 years ago, maybe not even 10 years ago. But I can't help but have this kind of recurring thought of, what if in some parallel universe, you were able to take the data in all of these clinical trials running around the world and watch the pandemic spread in it? And as an industry, we didn't. That's the end of the argument matter. But we have patients, even on the Medidata platform, like millions of patients in almost every country, right? Including people in the parts of China where it would have been really convenient to track things early. We could have watched this virus spread around the planet by looking at these patients in clinical trials, coming down with symptoms. We're recording all of their adverse events. And we have this beautiful data set with their vital signs and their medical histories. And just to finish the thought of why I think this was such a missed opportunity, the reason the book is called The Patient Equation is because of this idea of going from kind of a univariate to a multivariate view of health. What does that mean for research? What does that mean for life sciences? And like the simplest example is like, you have high cholesterol, yes, no, if yes, take statin, right? It's like a univariate, very simple thing. If you went back half a year ago, I probably would have said there's two important variables in terms of thinking about, you're exposed to SARS-CoV-2, you have to worry about COVID-19. One is, what's your age, right? The older you are, the worse off you are. The other is, what's your immune status? Is it compromised or not compromised? And by the way, those two inputs are important, but clearly there's other important inputs.
Yeah.
And there's other interesting and maybe really important outputs related to things that aren't COVID-19, but are related to other SARS-CoV-2 induced conditions, like some of this inflammatory stuff that we're seeing in children. So wouldn't it be great if we had a data set where we had this really nice curated data for all these people, and we could have assembled it and watched it progress and maybe figured out what some of the important inputs or even outputs are of kind of the equation of thinking about SARS-CoV-2. And I think it's important to think about this as a failure of the industry at large, to realize that this was a useful set of information that we could have had. so that we don't blow it next time, right? And I don't know if next time's 10 years from now or 100 years from now, but if we think differently about data, if we think differently about collaboration, we would have a much healthier planet than we're going to end this thing in.
Well, I think one of the challenges with that is that, especially for, either future looking or real time analytics, you have to already be taking the right data, right? And I think in general, you talk about some really interesting sources of data in the book. And for this one, imagine, one of the things that you talked about early in the book is say range, the amount of ground someone covers or the actual places that they go. Right. So if we rewound the clock and we had a measurement, both like that, if we took, say, range and number of encounters, right? If you kind of tracked the number of people that you were around, perhaps we would be smarter about this. But the challenge always with data is that hindsight is, once you understand a little bit, you could say, aha, I know what data we would have liked to have started to take 6 months ago. And the question now, I suppose, is what data do we start thinking about now that helps track the next one or change the next one?
Yeah.
Because for all of these, the data has to be good, and you have to have people that actually buy into taking it.
So I 100% agree with you. I do think that there's an interesting thing in research, in clinical research projects, which is that because you don't know what you're looking for beyond efficacy, because you're looking for different kinds of safety signals. You're collecting a lot of data about patients in general. And because you really want to understand how to label your drug, you have to get a very elaborate view of a patient's medical history. And by the way, when things go wrong, those adverse events do happen, you're keeping track of everything that happens to those patients in a way that's not in medical charts. I was at a DataVant conference, and somebody made a really interesting comment about like medical records, and like date of death is in nobody's medical chart, right? Who would write it down? Why would your doctor write it? Right?
You're done taking data.
Right.
Yep.
So when you think about research data, it is complete in a way that, or at least comprehensive in a way that a lot of data isn't. And I was invited to speak at a stroke conference about research. And I thought, wow, I better say like the first 5 words on stage that I don't know anything about cardiology. And so I kind of declared that. And I said, but if I was talking to a bunch of oncologists about making mathematical models for cancer progression, I would tell them that if they're only looking in cancer studies, their model's not going to be that great because they don't have time zero. Everybody already has cancer.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you go look in cardiology studies, you can see all these patients who were in cardiology studies at the moment they were diagnosed with cancer. And you can see the whole run-up of their vital signs or how much they were moving around, which is the example of the book, or all these other things. Is it a perfect data set? Maybe not, but it's using data in different ways than you expected. And I think that's a very underused data set. And of course, then all the cardiologists are sitting there thinking, wow, like it's actually cardiac side effects that people are looking for in oncology studies. Why am I not looking in that data for interesting things for me? So when you think about all of these clinical trials in that example, but as a way to look at infectious disease data, you go, why are we not doing that? And so I definitely agree. It's sometimes very difficult, if not impossible, or even dangerous to kind of use data retrospectively if you didn't design it for what your analysis is going to be. But that doesn't mean that's always the case. And so I think, I won't quite say shame on us, but lesson learned. I hope that we can think differently about this in the future.
Well, technically the window is still open. So, it's the next best time to learn is kind of now.
So it's pretty interesting. We created a supplemental offering for people who are running clinical trials in different therapeutic areas where I think we're going to see so many more trials now that connect to patients directly and try to talk to them in their home. We basically said, we don't care what the therapeutic area is. If you want to connect to your patients in your new or ongoing clinical trial, you can get an app, you can get a portal, and we will just keep engaging that patient on what's going on from their COVID-19 symptomatic perspective, because you should know that, right? You need to know that, regardless of whether you're doing something in diabetes or oncology. And so I think you're right. The window is still open.
And where does consumer data, right? Like, look, I'm wearing an Oura Ring and I have an Apple Watch on, and like, where does that fit in? It's clearly not as robust as clinical data, but is there a place for us to look for signals there?
So I think the answer is yes. It's almost like, you know, is there other life in the universe? Like, I'm 100% sure the answer is yes. I can't prove it because I can't put my finger on it. But when you add things up, it just seems like mathematically impossible that there wouldn't be. So are we going to have useful stuff from the consumer data that we have? It's like the number of solar systems and planets in the universe. Like, there's so much data that we're collecting about ourselves. I am 100% sure in my heart of hearts that it's going to be super useful in a lot of different therapeutic areas. At least right now, we have to talk about it largely by theoretical example. But that thing from the book, this idea of measuring how much people are moving around independent of anything else that's more therapeutic area specific. I am in no way suggesting that we're going to use like my number of steps to diagnose or to make a decision about course of therapy for a cancer I have. But maybe my level of activity going up or down is a piece of my behavioral, my cognitive phenotype that could be additive as another term in a more sophisticated equation that's inclusive of maybe my baseline genetics and whatever mutations are in my tumor and what's going on in my blood chemistry. And if I add my Oura Ring data, can I create a better predictive model? And sometimes the answer will be no. I suspect there'll be times when the answer is yes. And then kind of like, you know, there was the internet, and then all these companies, Medidata included, figured out how to use it to create value.
Right.
We all have these sensors all over us. I mean, you know, if you don't think you have a sensor on you, you do, because you keep this thing within a meter of you all day, right?
Yeah.
So we have this rich set of data to pull from, and I think that's going to be something that what's the opposite of the bad part of exploit? Like, we should exploit that in a value
leverage. We should leverage that.
Leverage. That's a good one.
Thank
you. You talk about the number of devices that you tend to wear. So you're actually a great example here. So how does your doctor feel about the data from either your heart patch or anything like that? Do you talk about your data with your doctor, and how is that received? You know, understanding that you might not be the typical patient in this one, but how does your doctor respond to that kind of data for you?
Yeah. So my doctor's my friend. Like I love Dan. So he knows that I'm obsessed with this stuff, and he also loves data. So, you know, the idea of looking at, I actually have an Apple Watch. I wear it almost exclusively at night because I'm like obsessed with my sleep data now. And I'll just give you a practical example. Like, if you're looking to manage your sleep, again, I'll just presume that people on the phone think that's an important thing. I've realized that if I'm like good and I exercise and I actually got a good night's sleep the night before and I eat well and I don't have too much alcohol in a day, like, you know, my resting heart rate is like, you know, undetectable. You know, my heart rate variability is like
dead for a period.
At the end of the spectrum. And then what you can see is you can kind of like see my heart rate variability go down and my resting heart rate go up, depending on how many of those good behaviors I just described I don't do well in a particular day. And so when you think about stuff like that, and you think about the ability to almost create like your own little model, your own little equation, I think that's really effective. And I think if you've got a physician who not just enjoys, but feels like that's something that they can leverage, you know, and you can watch data kind of in partnership, I think that gives you yet another component of, or in many cases, maybe an alternative course of therapy for things that aren't that serious, or maybe a component, as I said, like of your therapy for things that are serious, like make sure everything else, you know, is healthy at the same time.
At the very least, it gives you a more quantified picture of your health, for lack of a better word, right? It gives you a better picture of you as a patient rather than a simple, you know, lab panel snapshot that you might get at that meeting.
Yeah, the literally the very beginning of the book, since there are plenty of spoilers in the conversation, which I think is fun, right? is
The rest of the book is good too. Everyone should still buy it and read it. We've only covered a very small slice.
but there's this guy who sadly is passed away now, Jack Whalen, who was a cancer patient, and was the first person I ever saw doing this. And he showed it to me. He would track certain markers on a spreadsheet, and he went from clinical trial to clinical trial, and with great visualization, you could see, like, here's the date he started this trial, and here's what happened to this marker, and then it went down, and then he struggled, he was okay for a while, and then he started to have recurrence and went to another trial. It was like very visual. And I am, again, we need to have a parallel universe to do the experiment, but I am very sure that Jack lived a lot longer, because he was doing this tracking. And he, I think, towards the end of the course of him trying to manage his cancer, started to find a lot of people who really understood what he was doing and bought into it. But I think in the beginning, it was like, here's this crazy patient with his Excel spreadsheet. I remember back in my Columbia days, I met a guy, I have no idea whatever happened to him, or I can't even remember his name. We consented him to be in the trial that I was doing for prostate cancer. And in his wallet, he had a piece of paper with dates and his PSA, his prostate specific antigen scores.
Yep.
And he was an engineer, and it was on cut up piece of graph paper. And that was his thing. Like, I think that was probably the first time I ever saw a patient tracking something, that way. I think that will become the norm. I think Apple and Google think that's going to become the norm. And this is a conversation about privacy. I guess we could talk about that, but I think that's a good thing to have. Like, I want to see all my medical data. I want to see those charts. I want to be able to intervene early when it looks like something's going awry. So I think that's the way the world can and should work, and hopefully it will get there faster.
Yeah. And I've become pretty obsessed. I've only been wearing the Aura Ring for like a week, and I'm like, I wake up every morning and immediately see what my sleep score was.
Yeah.
But it makes me think about it, and I didn't really think about it before.
No, and there's nothing wrong with like gamification and engagement. I mean, that's a good thing, right? The fact that you want to wake up and see that score, or you're sharing your data with other people, that's not terrible. I mean, look, in whether it's because you are healthy, or even if you have something that's wrong with you and you're in a community of people like that, that's why patient advocacy organizations are one of the reasons why they're so important, is because you're part of something that motivates you, and I really believe that makes a big difference. You cannot disconnect cognition from biology, right? You think things, and your brain releases stuff that affects the rest of your body, and vice versa. And so the more we can think about whatever it takes to get us to behave well or to have a good response, the better.
Yeah. So just in this parallel line, there's a good question from Luke Rosen in the audience. And he basically says, if the virus isn't going anywhere soon, can we basically take the opportunity to develop what we can call kind of a natural history of COVID, right? It's now, what are some of the things that we can do to basically try to develop things that will allow us to learn about, both the real time and the long tail effect of the disease on patients. And, it's the long tail that I think is really challenging, because you aren't going to be able to magically look back and get the data that you wished you had. The thing with long tail effects is you have to start measuring now.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I think Luke, you're absolutely right. Like, that's the opportunity. And I think we are doing that in different ways. Not that I always don't think we can be doing things differently and better, but at least right now, I see people doing that in clinical research. Like, people are trying to superimpose this information on data sets that exist or new data being collected. Actually, I mentioned DataVant before. I think the conference was on my mind because we're actually doing something with them and a bunch of other companies. And it's not that Medidata is the only company doing good stuff here, but we're actually looking at linking records across different data sets. So can we start to look at maybe what we might know about a patient who's in a research project, but can we link back to their electronic health record data that we can get from another source, and actually create a much more comprehensive from a timeline perspective and probably from a data depth perspective view of what's happening to patients. In this case, it's what's happening to patients who don't get COVID-19 is just as interesting as what happens in patients who do.
Sure.
Because we want to figure out if there are certain things that might protect you or alter the course of the disease. Why do you have a mild case versus a terrible case or a life-threatening case? People are starting to assemble that data. But yes, that is what you are asking about is exactly the thinking that I think we need more of in our industry.
Yeah. So to rewind a little bit, one of the things that Medidata had started in the last little bit is something called Acorn AI.
Yeah.
And I would think it would be great to hear a little bit about the vision of that, because number one, you probably sit on a more interesting and more comprehensive data source than most AI companies have access to. And now thinking about it in terms of either COVID or other sorts of forward-looking challenges, what was your vision for creating it in the first place, and where do you think it can go now?
Yeah, so Acorn really is the manifestation of what I was saying before. You have all this data, and what can you float on top of it? To be perfectly clear, it is not our data, right? It is our clients' data, right? So the people who are running these clinical trials need to voluntarily put their data into these pools, where we will then, with them, do de-identification and homogenization and offer them some really interesting things because they want to do that. And it's usually around, and certainly we apply analytics to kind of the data sets that exist in individual silos in really actually useful ways as well. But I think some of the most exciting stuff that we're doing in Acorn is around collaboration, as I said. And so let's give you an example in oncology. So if you look at the idea of running a randomized study in a life-threatening cancer, I'm sure you can extend this to other life-threatening conditions, and as the patient you hear, okay, well, you're either going to get the current standard of care that's not great, or flip a coin, you might get this great new drug. I really don't want the standard of care. And maybe I'd be able to, or I, as the patient, would be more interested in enrolling in something where I had a better chance of getting the exciting new therapy.
Right.
Maybe if I was the life sciences company, or for sure if I was the life sciences company, and said, well, instead of having to have 150 patients who get your drug and 150 patients who get standard of care, which means you'd need to find 300 volunteers, not only could I make it easier for people to want to volunteer, but I only have to find 150 volunteers if I didn't have to have the placebo arm. Now, we all know that you need to do a good job in research, that the placebo effect is real. I need a control group, right? But if I have 5 companies who are all running a clinical trial in the same cancer, why do I need 5 control arms with people on standard of care? Shouldn't I just be able to look at one control arm? And this is an example that we've actually seen certain drugs be approved using like real world data outside of clinical trial data, right? So if you just look at the history of this disease in patients who are in practice, it's so terrible that if you look at just patients who are in this clinical trial that is uncontrolled, they do so much better that was good enough to approve the drug on. We're doing it now with that very high quality research data. So it's exactly what I was talking about before. Can we bring data from multiple studies together? And can we effectively create what is a shared control? We call it a synthetic control arm. That makes it sound kind of artificial. The synthesis is of patients from different studies into a cohort that becomes a legitimate comparator for what's in the clinical trial. And not to get super technical, but I'm sure a lot of people on the call think about like Kaplan-Meier curves, right? So you have these kind of like survival curves in terms of how people are responding to your therapy versus another therapy, or therapy A versus therapy B. And what we're really trying to do with Acorn is make it so that as you are evaluating any therapy, you can look at your survival curve, you can look at the average survival curve across people who are getting the standard of care in clinical trials. We're bringing in the survival curve of people who are not in clinical trials. I even think that we're going to start to be able to help let people compare things. It's obviously deeper than survival curves, but it's an aspect of this. Compare survival curves, not just across patients on standard of care versus a new drug, but let's look at 3 or 4 new drugs. This is really what some of the most collaborative, interesting, adaptive clinical trials like I-SPY2 and Lung Map and GBM Agile are doing, right? They're comparing what drugs are working better or worse that are all new drugs in patients by making a mathematical model of what patients are like other patients. You know,
Right.
I'm an individual, but I probably look like some other patients if you look at kind of certain aspects of my physiology and genetics. Well, let's look at patients like me as a group and what worked for them. I should get that, right, if it worked for them. And so we're creating that model, but using data that we all have access to already. And so I think that the kind of thing where it's out of the box, it requires access to and a relationship with a lot of companies, which we do have at Medidata, who can feed these data sets and benefit from this aggregation. And you need some really smart people, not just to design the algorithms, but to actually help people figure out what to do with that data differently, how to think differently about their clinical development programs and get these drugs, not just through an interesting mathematical exercise, but use this to get them approved. And we have a client who's right now fast tracking something, hopefully based on using this kind of data as example. So, you know, we go hand in hand with them. Here's how the regulators are going to think about it. This is what you need to show. So all of that is part of what we do in Acorn. Yeah, it's kind of like our really cool stuff.
And you know, and for the stat nerds, you can age match things. You can basically match the patient populations to each other so that you're not introducing bias in there when you start with a richer data set. But thinking to that, you know, we have a challenge on, you know, diversity in clinical trials, right? You know, and this is really forward looking. So how do we get more diversity in clinical trials from your perspective? And we had a good question here specifically saying, how do we get more women into clinical trials? Because there's ramifications for not having them involved. And, you know, especially with younger women, you know, specific to the question, they're choosing, you know, not to be on birth control because it's actually an exclusionary criteria for the trial itself. How do we do better with issues like that? How do we get more diverse pools of representation in clinical research?
Yeah, so this is something that we feel super passionately about at Medidata. Actually, not like a year ago, it was one of the themes of our user group meeting was diversity in clinical trials. And it's a real problem. Even now, if you go look at some of the published data on the vaccines, like everybody who's in those trials, at least the data that's been published, is white. And if you look at the number of people who are in the Black African-American community versus who are Caucasian, who are disproportionately suffering from COVID-19, like it doesn't match what's in the clinical trial. Now, I might be naively less worried about that from a vaccine perspective, but it's just not, even if it's scientifically okay, it's not morally okay. And it is a microcosm of a problem that we have, certainly in many ways around the world, but definitely in America, around access, right? And so I think that the key to diversity in clinical trial data, which is going to be ethically and scientifically and commercially better, is to solve the problem of access. And so I wish I had all the answers for that. Some of the things that can be done that we're doing is figuring out how to work with different communities that are underrepresented, that have less access. So for example, we work with a group called the Lazarex Foundation that helps a community center. It might be based in a literal community center, it might be based in a church, figure out how we can get people in that community to understand what's happening in clinical trials, get them to a clinical trial, make sure that they can deal with the logistics of getting there and not going to work and whatever needs to be done to make it physically possible for them to do something that frankly is way easier if you are in the right affluent community and live next to a fancy medical center. So there's things that we can kind of societally do. There's things that we can technically do. I think we're going to see, as I said before, so many more clinical trials now that take advantage of what was kind of a niche idea of like virtual clinical trials where, you know, the clinical trial is real, but we connect to the patient online. We use sensors, we ship drug to their house instead of to the hospital. Like that's just going to make it easier for us to engage people and get more people into these studies. And so, you know, we'll continue to, I think, work on that. I think it's going to be, I think it's a problem that's going to take us years to solve. Again, the faster, obviously, the better. But access is the issue that I really feel like will fix clinical trial thing. A little plug for my friend, he just won an Emmy Award for the show called Tu Salud, Tu Familia, which is in the DC area. And it's basically a show on Telemundo, which is about research and your health. And it's for the Latinx community that is underrepresented and underserved and needs to get these therapies. And so, you know, I think if you associate yourself and you encourage, whether it's you and the people you know, or certainly a company that's in the position to bend the curve on that stuff, to take advantage of those community outreach things, I think that's something we should all be doing.
Well, and it's also a combination of not only finding these diverse clinical trial participants where they receive care, but if they don't receive care, how do we get to them and let them start to access care, but then also access things like clinical trials. And I think digital really is going to be the only way we get them into types of care and make them aware of that.
Yeah, I mean, like many other things, I think that digitization has the ability to democratize what we're doing in a lot of healthcare. Right? Yeah, that's a good thing.
All right. Well, we have 3 minutes left, and I have to ask you about the final frontier. So, talk to us about going to space.
Yeah. So I always wanted to be an astronaut. Yeah, I have a Virgin Galactic ticket. I got it for myself for my 40th birthday, which is a long time ago now. I still haven't gone, but you know, they're really close. I have some friends who have been to space, like legit astronauts. And one of the things that I have heard consistently from them is that they can't really have the conversation with people who haven't experienced it. It's hard to really put into words, but you feel differently about the planet. You feel differently about people when you see it from space. And yeah, I love planes and I love rockets and I'm super psyched to do it for that perspective. But I think it might be really life-changing from what I've heard and read about. And so I actually think like encouraging whether it's SpaceX or whether it's Virgin Galactic, this idea that maybe we can like, you know, get kids up into space for summer camp. You know, maybe that's 10 years from now, maybe it's 20, but maybe the world would be a better place if everybody got a little bit of that perspective. And so I'm indulging myself with going to space, but hopefully there's some societal benefit, but I'll tell you about it hopefully in the next year or two.
Yeah, we'll have you back awesome. As a guest once you've gone and come back.
Glen Vries,
like Astro Bob and Doug.
And Medidata co-CEO.
Also co-CEO of Medidata, but we'll talk to you about your astronaut experience next.
I look forward to that.
But listen, thanks so much for being with us. You know, I think we've hit on so many things here, and the common theme is that, you know, there's more to find, and there's more to see, and there's more to discover with regard to healthcare, whether it's here, whether it's in space. So thank you so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate it. And, you know, again, everyone here can follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. We post these videos onto our YouTube channel. You know, Glen Vries, thanks so much for being on the webinar this morning. All right, and we can sign off. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.